Welcome to the kingdom. I'm Chris, and this is Good Enough Gaming. So a buddy and I sat down today to play a game of OPR, opened up our lists, and bam, everything changed. Point values were different, rules were different. 3rd edition hit us overnight, and we were not ready for it. So I figured this would be a great time to do a little summary so that other people don't get blindsided quite the way we did. Now, I've started playing one-page rules quite a while ago, about halfway through 8th edition, when 40k just became so cumbersome, so many books, and then 9th edition just was the final nail in the coffin. I wanted a game that was fun to play, where I could still enjoy great-looking models, have a good time at a game, not need a doctorate in rules, and not have to set aside half of a weekend just to play a game. So that's when I started experimenting and exploring with one-page rules, and I found a lot of what I was looking for. So to see that they have a 3rd edition coming out now is pretty cool, because it means that there's enough demand, that there's enough support behind the game, that they actually want to see this game improve, and that they're making changes based on what they're hearing back from players and everyone else who takes part in it. So the first thing I wanted to comment on about one-page rules in general is that its greatest strength is also its biggest weakness. And that is its 2 flagship games, or the ones that are probably going to be played the most. Grimdark Future and Fantasy are the same game. And I don't just mean they're similar. They are the same game. Same rules, same special rule names, only the aesthetic really changes. As far as their skirmish versions of those games, there's some slight differences in them. And then for Faster Than Light, their spaceship combat game, that one has enough differences that, yeah, it's similar but not the same. But everything else uses the same rule set and just scales it from single models to squads to regiments that are set in a block. So that's good, because it means if you finish one game or play one game, you already know how to play everything else, and you can switch games very easily. The downside, it means there's no variety. So that's both, I think, a strength and a weakness for the game. Without even opening the book, the first thing I notice is that the art is getting better. You look at the covers of these books, even if I'd never heard of this game before, if I saw this on a cover at a bookstore, I would at least pick it up and look through it to see what other art was inside and maybe take a glance at the rules. So clearly they're putting a little more effort into this. If you looked at the art from the previous one, it looked like something they handed to a buddy who had some artistic skill but quickly just jotted down or drew something to give it some flavor to it. But these ones now, these look like serious drawings that are meant to portray a serious game and not just a rage quit from 40k, which is basically what one-page rules started as. So the first significant difference to the rules isn't necessarily an addition, but simply a clarification or two. First, they introduce some base size recommendations that if you're playing infantry, cavalry, beast, monster, vehicle, chariot, stuff like that, they give at least a range of where your base sizes should be. Previously, with the rules as written, you could put down a goblin on a 25mm base and say, yeah, I'm running him as a titan. And there was no rule that said you couldn't. As long as your opponent was okay with it, you could actually do it. Now they're starting to say, all right, somewhere between 20mm and 32mm, that's the size of your infantry. Anything bigger than that, you're moving on to something else. The next change is line of sight, and this is the first time I've ever seen a rule set do something like this. They provide 3 different ways to use line of sight in the game. True line of sight, what they call 2-dimensional line of sight, and then 3-dimensional line of sight. And they recommend that you start with the first one, true line of sight, which is what most wargamers are familiar with. Get down behind the model and see what it can see. The second one, 2D line of sight, is kind of bird's eye view. You simply draw a line from the base of the shooter to the base of the target, and if it crosses anything along the path, then there is terrain and cover. And then the third way is you treat each model's base almost like a soda can, of the circumference of the base and then a set height. And if any part of that soda can space can see any part of the target soda can space, then that considers line of sight. So the rules recommend starting with the simplest and then changing it based on your needs. And that I found really impressive. They don't just demand you will do line of sight the way we say. They say, here's 3 different ways to do it. You find the one that works best with you. Here's what we recommend. The next is that what used to be known as the competitive rule restrictions for OPR in their army builder has now been changed, and it's simply called the optional force organization. So you don't have to use it. You can if you want, but it puts limits on how many of each unit you can take, how many of this you can have, how many of that you can have, which was similar to the old competitive rules to maybe keep things a little more fair. Although I found just using the flat point system, I never had games that were complete blowouts. It was always pretty close, or if one side did lose overwhelmingly, it was because they made a bad decision or had a series of really, really bad die rolls. The last general gameplay basic that they changed is terrain rules have been dramatically expanded, whereas previously there were only about 3 different types of terrain and 3 different effects of terrain. Now there's about a half a dozen of each, and they actually provide samples of how to mix and match them for certain terrain. So they recommend, for example, with forests, you use difficult terrain, you use cover granting terrain, and you use a rule where you can see into it, you can see out of it, but you can't see through it. So again, they give recommendations, but they tell the players, you decide. You could make every piece of terrain your own different set of rules, however you want, as long as both players agree and it's clear. That's the most important thing. One of the big rules changes that comes to terrain, they've already mentioned on their website, and that's the change to cover. Whereas previously cover used to grant a -1 to hit, it now grants a +1 to save. And I can see the wisdom in terms of just lore-wise of what would be more likely to happen for each one. But they decided that in terms of making the game a little more fair, not penalizing the units and the models that have a really bad quality, that the +1 to cover still gave you some benefit for being in cover, but it was a benefit that could be overcome with some tactics and planning, whereas the -1 to hit rendered some armies almost entirely obsolete. Now let's move on to the special rules, and it's here we'll see the most dramatic changes to the game. Some entirely new rules added, some have been slightly tweaked, some have been majorly revised. The first big one, and I'd say probably one of the biggest, is the rule for casters. This is a complete change over the way that it used to be. Previously, every wizard could either cast one spell or deny one spell. They picked a spell from the list, they rolled a dice. If they met the number with their bonus added, it went off, otherwise it didn't. Now there's a mix of tokens, or if you're familiar with previous editions of 40k, like warp charges and dice. So casters will get a specific number of warp charges every time they activate, and they can spend them or bank them up to a total of 6. Then when they want to cast a spell, they have to spend a certain number of these tokens equal to the level of the spell, and spells will be levels 1, 2, and 3. With the remaining tokens, they can spend those to improve their dice roll. So say you want to cast a level 2 spell, it's going to cost you 2 tokens. Once you spend the tokens to cast the spell, you still have to roll a dice, and on a 4+, the spell succeeds. If, however, you've banked up 4 tokens, you can spend 2 to cast the level 2 spell, and the next 2 to reduce the required target number from a 4 to a 3 to a 2. So for 4 tokens, you can cast a level 2 spell at a 2+ roll. So there's a benefit to sometimes banking, versus if there's a clutch spell that you need to get off, you can go ahead and do it. And it also prevents you from banking up a huge number and casting a level 3 spell at 2+ every turn or something crazy like that. But the counter to that is wizards across the board, I think, have gone up, or at least in the armies that I've played so far. So previously they were really, really good, whereas now they're still good, but you have to use them a little more carefully. They're not a guaranteed or a near guaranteed buff every single turn. So they're a little more expensive, but if you use them right, they can still pay off. So I would say that's probably one of the biggest changes to the 3rd edition of one-page rules, is how they work with magic and psychic powers. Going alphabetically here, the next one, counter, is simply a counter charge. If you get charged, you actually get to attack before the charging unit gets to do anything to you. So that'd be an interesting defensive buff to put on your characters that are holding objectives. Entrenched is also an entirely new rule. If you're outside of 12 inches and the target of a shooting attack, you are -2 to hit. And since most other rules that have a penalty to hit stack, things like stealth, you could make your army darn near impossible to hit with anything but 6s. So entrenched, that's totally new. Fast and slow haven't been changed, but they have been clarified. Previously, the old rule referenced the basic movement rules, and with other buffs and debuffs increasing and decreasing, things could get a little messy with the way it's worded. So now it's very simple. Fast adds 2 to advance and adds 4 to rush and charge. Slow removes 2, subtract 2 to advance, and subtract 4 from rush and charge. And of course that stacks onto any other benefits or disadvantages. Fearless has changed as well. On paper, it's a fairly significant change. It previously used to be +1 to your morale roll. Now, you take the morale roll as normal, but if you fail, you roll the dice again, and on a 4+, you pass. So it's not a better chance of passing the first time, it's a 50-50 chance of passing a failed one. So, like I said, on paper, that's a fairly significant change. I'd have to play a few games to see whether it's better, worse, or 6 of one, half dozen of the other. The next major change, Furious. And this was one of the rules that OPR had said they're going to make changes to because they realized free attacks are just too powerful if you give them out too often. So Furious used to be every model got an extra attack with one weapon of its choice. Instead now, 6s explode and do double. So every natural roll of a 6 to hit on the charge gives you 2 hits instead of 1. And you're not going to be rolling that many 6s. So now Furious units might get 15% more attacks on the charge, whereas previously they got 100% more, or at least 50, depending on the unit. So that's a really big change. Moving on, the hero rule has been altered a bit to close a loophole. In the previous rules, it simply said one hero can only ever be joined to one unit, but it didn't say that one unit could only have one hero. And so it was, in one interpretation of the rules, and unfortunately this is one I abused the heck out of, you could take a big unit and put 2 or 3 heroes in it. And so you'd end up with your melee unit that gets +1 on the charge from this hero, and it moves faster with this hero, and it has regeneration with this hero, and it was a Death Star. But come on, I've only ever played 40k before. That's how you build units in 40k. I wasn't used to this whole balance thing that one-page rules was doing. So the new hero rule specifically says one unit can only join one hero, and one hero can only join one unit that doesn't have another hero in it. Next change, Impact. This is another one that's been changed pretty dramatically. It used to be Impact granted a free auto hit on a successful charge. So if a character or a unit with Impact charged into another unit, they'd get free hits and then would get to roll their regular attacks. So now what they have is a free attack, but at a 2+. So this is an interesting change because in some ways it's almost the same thing. You get a free attack, there is a chance you could miss. Very small, but it's not a guarantee, whereas previously Impact was a guarantee. However, even though you lose the guarantee, you might still get your armor piercing on that attack. And I would rather get 3 or 4 attacks with my AP value than 5 attacks without one. And the old Impact had 0 AP. So this one, while it looks like it's a nerf, it might actually be an improvement. Closely tied to that one is the new Lance rule. Lance used to simply grant Impact. Impact 1. Now instead, on the turn it charges, the unit that charges with Lance gets +2 AP on the charge. So this is a fairly significant change. Giving Lance used to pretty much double the number of hits you got on a charge. Instead now, you only get the same number of hits as your base stat, but those are stronger hits on the charge. So the definite shift here is from a quantity of attacks to a quality of attacks. I'd say one of the biggest special rules changes is Poison. Got a massive nerf, but it was kind of needed. If you had it in the right circumstances, it could be absolutely devastating. So it previously was 6s to hit exploded to 3 times. 1 hit of a 6 was equal to 3 hits. It has been changed now that your opponent, the target, has to re-roll 6s to save. So that's a pretty significant change from nearly tripling the number of hits to re-rolling a few successful saves. So you're not going to see, for example, the Custodian equivalent army. They used to, one of their units had basic poison on their attacks, and a unit of 3 or 4 of those could obliterate just about anything. Now, they'll still do damage, but they're not just a street sweeper. Relentless, compared with the other changes that have happened with rules like Poison and Lance and Impact, Relentless, strangely enough, got a fairly okay buff. It used to be on a 6 to hit in shooting, you got another attack that could hit, that could miss, and could not generate extra attacks. Now, with Relentless, 6s to hit are just auto 2 hits. So, definitely better than what it was before. It's for shooting, not for melee, but it just seems strange that when the point of 3rd edition was to reduce the number of free hits, Relentless actually gives more. Reliable is the next rule. It's a brand new one, and it grants a 2+ quality with that particular weapon. And I can see the use for this for when you have, for example, units of Imperial Defense or Imperial Guardsmen or human defense forces that have a quality of like 5, but you want to have a sergeant or a lieutenant or some kind of commanding officer with a quality of 5. That just doesn't make sense. You can give them this weapon where using the weapon it's a 2, but everything else it's still a 5. So it's a way for them to adjust certain skills and qualities as needed without giving an entire unit or an entire army a massive buff. So a good change there, or addition. The last 2 special rules to change are rending and transport. Rending stays mostly the same. It's still 6s to hit are resolved at AP 4, but previously in 2nd edition, no regeneration at all was allowed against rending. Now regeneration is allowed, but with a -1, meaning that your regeneration is only a 6, and according to the rules, even if you have a regeneration of 6, you still get a regeneration of 6 because the 6 always succeeds. So it's a pretty significant change for the target if it has regeneration. So armies like the Undead, armies like the Robot Legions are going to benefit the most from this. Last of all, transport, kind of like Hero, they closed a loophole that was there. According to the rules as written, as long as the toughness of the creature or the monster or the model was enough for the transport capacity of the vehicle, you could march right in. So technically a knight could get inside a transport just as long as it had the space. So now only units of toughness 6 or less can get inside transports. And if a model has toughness 3, it counts as 3 models. So you can't take your little pickup truck and cram in a whole bunch of massive heavy infantry. So those are the 3rd edition changes in a nutshell. It's not everything, but I imagine that'll cover most of the stuff you'll run into in each game. I'm excited to try the new edition. If I left anything out or got anything wrong that was significant, let me know down in the comments. And while these new rules may not be perfect, I do believe that they are good enough. Thanks for watching.